Hey everybody, what's going on? I'm DJ Sixsmith. Welcome to Sit Down. Amanda Fairbanks is here with us. Brand new book, The Lost Boys of Montauk. Amanda, really nice to meet you. How are you?
Hey, DJ, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
It is great to talk to you. And you've had a wonderful career in journalism and you've bounced around to the Times and Huffington Post and all these different places. But this seems like a really intense project. And there are folks that are familiar with this story in Montauk in terms of these men going out to sea and never coming home, a really tragic story. There are probably some people who've never heard this story too, and you're putting it out there in a bigger way. So how did you first hear about it and what was it like writing the book?
Right. So thank you. Yes, I'm a longtime print and newspaper reporter, and this is my first book. And it took me I've really been working on it for about the last 3.5 years. So let's go back to the winter of 2016. And I was sitting upstairs in the East Hampton Star office on Main Street. I was a staff writer there. And a new editor at the time started telling me about the great untold story of the so-called Hamptons. And he was getting ready to launch a magazine, and he started talking about tilefish and this boat called the Windblown, and these 4 beautiful young men who had lost their lives in March of 1984. And during the same conversation, he also introduced me to this woman, Mary Stedman, who was the widow of the young captain. And he was going on and on about Mary. And I said, well, this sounds incredible, but why don't you want to write it? And he said, well, for years I've thought about the story and I've wanted to write it, but it really has to be told by an outsider. I'm way too close to the story. And, there would be family members and friends that would be annoyed by him for diving into it and doing so. So for better or for worse, he put me in touch with Mary, and the timing wasn't right. And for 2 years we lived in California, and Mary and I sort of kept in touch, and the momentum really began with Mary. We eventually sat down together to talk, and it started going forward from there. And once I had about 10,000-ish interview notes on my computer, I felt like this was not a newspaper or a magazine story that needed to be told, but the beginnings of a book. So I interviewed over 100 people.
Wow.
Dove into private and public correspondence and, public records and what have you. It's finally out on May 25th.
So after doing all the research, talking to all the people, how important was it that you were an outsider telling the story here?
Obviously this book could have been written by an insider. This book could have been written by one of the family members, one of the loved ones. I became particularly interested in the story, not just because of the 4 young men, but because of the women that they had left behind, the widow and the girlfriends and the mothers, and how it was after this tragedy that each of them would piece their lives back together in the years and decades since. And I do think, being an outsider to the story, I wasn't beholden to anyone's particular version of what had happened. I do live here. I live in Sag Harbor, and I love living here, but I'm not from here. I grew up on the West Coast. So I have a real fondness and an appreciation for the area and the history. But I'm also, this is not an authorized biography. This was one journalist's sort of objective retelling of what had occurred based on all of those different interviews and sources.
What do you think was most striking about your conversations with the women left behind and just all the people who didn't have these men come home?
Right. So honestly, I have such reverence for everyone in the story, the survivors especially. It made me think back to the whalers of a prior century, given that I live in a whaling village. And, these men would go out to sea for years, months, if not years at a time. And the women were left behind to raise the children and to kind of keep their households going. And sometimes their men just would never come back. And eventually they would put up a gravestone, and they would have been declared lost at sea. So this is obviously a much more modern day version of that. This is 1984. This is 4 young men with various class differences aboard this boat. But it was fascinating to me to learn about trauma's sort of insidious effect on people's lives, and some of whom have sort of moved on more successfully than others after this incident. But it was a real kind of before and after moment for each of these women. And I would say that none of them were who they were before that this had occurred. This changed their lives forever.
What was most surprising about writing this whole thing?
I think the most surprising, and to be honest, the most thrilling thing about the story and why it became sort of an obsession as a writer and a reporter was because I went in thinking like the story was up on one layer, right? And as I dove deeper into the story, there was this layer and all these rich layers of history um, and all along there was this sort of true story just waiting to be told. And I felt very called to tell the story and do this work. So that was maybe my favorite part of the thrilling part of it.
I mean, there's so many different interesting angles to this. You mentioned the fact that this is a whaling town, right? It's a town that has been driven by the fishing business and the whaling business, and yet it has these ultra rich people that have come through over the decades. So how have those two things clashed together, and what was it like just kind of looking at the intersection of those two worlds coming together?
Absolutely. So in addition to the women piece of this story, this is very much a story about fathers and sons. So, these four men found themselves on this boat. They were caught in this horrific storm. They never came back. But through my reporting, I discovered that they all shared one thing in common, which was this very intense dynamic between their fathers, whether their fathers had been absent or alcoholics or dead or some combination of all of those. And I'm not suggesting that they were sitting out, on this fishing boat, like talking about their issues with their dads, but there was a uniting force of what sort of led them all to sea. It's this sort of universal search for identity. And aboard this boat, which was so fascinating because it's often not the case, the captain's father had gone to Harvard and he was a really big guy at the UN. And, his first mate was a Maidstone Club kid, which is like unheard of, that he would grow up in a Park Avenue penthouse and find himself working as a commercial fisherman. And then of course, the two youngest guys, Scott and Mike Vigilant, were much more Montauk working class, Long Island working class. And, for Mike Vigilant in particular, his father was a commercial fisherman who had also lost his life. And, they weren't surfing on their days off. They were fishermen. And it was really the collision of all of these different lives and backgrounds aboard this boat, which became just a really interesting microscope to see how it is that these worlds, just as you mentioned, the very, very affluent, the extreme working class sort of collide here. And oftentimes, as we know, they don't necessarily have a whole lot of interaction with one another.
Have you thought about how the book's going to be received in the area?
Well, I'm getting a lot of great praise from some people, and I think others will find it difficult. And I'm prepared for both of those reactions. Yeah.
What do you think will be most difficult for folks? Because you're shining a light on this story, right? And you're shining a light on the people who were left behind. But just to look at it from the other perspective, what do you think will be the hardest part for people to digest? Just the tragedy itself, or bringing the tragedy back up to light after all these decades here?
I think that there will probably be, some issue possibly with an outsider, a so-called outsider coming along and writing this story. I think, I had a conversation yesterday where a local journalist was telling me he wished he had written it, that type of thing, which I totally get. And I think, this is a story about families and secrets and, private lives. And I think all of our families are a whole lot more complicated than it would appear at the outset. So I hope it's received well, but obviously that's out of my control at this point.
And I think we can all connect universally, right? Some of us have never gone through a trauma like this, but all of our families have secrets. Like you said, all of our families struggle with things. And there's something really unifying in that. And there's also something really powerful in putting that out there. So what was the hardest part for you personally to write? Because you had these conversations, you did the research, but what was just the hardest thing to translate out into the page because of just the topic or just the nature of trying to write this thing?
Yes, of course. So I had, it was like dozens of conversations about grief and loss over and over and over again for months at a time, which was very difficult. Because I would talk to these men, these commercial fishermen who seemed really hardy and difficult to access emotionally. And they would be on the phone with me, or we would get a cup of coffee and they would be breaking down about this thing that had happened so many decades ago. And so it was really dark. Like a lot of the book to write and report was quite dark. And then I think the most thrilling part of it was that the captain's eldest son, Chris, who you come to know in quite a bit of detail near the very end of the book, my showing up in his life actually triggered like all of these things that you're talking about. Like, why is she asking me about this traumatic event? And it was this cascade of emotions that I think he had thought he had long since sort of dealt with. And when he brought me along on his healing journey of how to kind of piece his life back together was when sort of at the end of this long, dark tunnel, I saw sort of a glimmer of light and of hope. And I realized I had the ending of my book, and it felt uplifting after all of this tragedy and trauma, that some people go through those sorts of things and there's a redemption there. And obviously some people do not.
Yeah, I mean, just the psychological talk here is extraordinary, and that could be a conversation in and of itself, right?
Absolutely. Yes, yes, yes. There are many themes here. I mean, I can sit and talk about golden tilefish anytime. I'm happy to come back on.
You've been opened up to all these new worlds. A West Coast woman coming to the East Coast, learning about everything here. I mean, it's pretty cool.
I appreciate it. I really, really do. Yeah, no, it's been so thrilling to tell this story.
Awesome. Well, Amanda, really nice to meet you. Congrats on the
Thank you
book.
for your
And we'll
time
talk
and
to you down the
interest.
road, all right?